I think we should be starting now. So that's plenty of time for everyone to join in. So thank you once again for people that joined in this webinar. So today we are talking about cybersecurity game plan for digital health organizations. And this webinar is brought to you by Nord Security, so one of the world's leading cybersecurity solution providers here. And we have a massive topic to cover today. And obviously we'll try to make it conceivable. We'll try to split it into certain subtopics itself and just dive as deep as we can with the perfect speakers that we have here today. So we're going to try to pick their brains a bit. And of course, in this particular topic, a couple of things we'll focus on. It's cybersecurity challenges that digital health organizations face. And are those different to cybersecurity challenges that other organizations face? We'll see. And how to maintain consumer trust and adherence to regulation compliances itself that drives the need to prioritize the cybersecurity. So does that go hand in hand? What compliances the digital health organizations have to focus, where the cybersecurity aspect of it comes into play itself, and the balance between that innovation, agility, and high-level security, how to achieve that, how is it possible to do so? We'll try to dig down deeper into that. And probably just to quickly start off, I want to start with a couple of scary facts. So I'm not here to scare anyone, but I think it's interesting to outline that according to a recent study that we looked into, 71% of tested healthcare medical apps have at least one serious vulnerability into their application. So you can look at it as pretty much almost 1 in 4 apps that being tested have a vulnerability. And of course, that could actually lead to breach of medical data, which could obviously then escalate to a bunch of other issues and problems. And it's important to outline the average cost of a breach in a healthcare organization is around 10 million US dollars. So obviously it's a massive sum of money. And healthcare is the most expensive industry in terms of breaches for the 12 years running. So of course, this is a massive industry that should definitely focus on increasing that cybersecurity resilience itself. And all of these research, obviously, we just picked it up from recent studies. So that's important to note. But without further ado, let's introduce the speakers. So we have Beth Cartier. She's head of security and compliances at Maven Clinics. And Beth, perhaps you do the better justice of introducing yourself and a bit of your background.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So dead on, currently run the information security and compliance program at Maven Clinic, which is a like women and family building healthcare app. Previously a couple other places, but started out in incident response. So I sort of started this looking at all the terrible things that can happen, and now sort of am on the preventative side. So I'm in healthcare now, but worked in a bunch of different industries and somehow landed in one of the most regulated industries, which is sometimes super fun. We'll talk about that today, but thanks.
Thank you, Beth. Definitely valuable to have you here, and look forward to picking your brain a bit. And then we have Rob Picard. So Rob is security lead at Vanta. And of course, Rob has huge expertise in the field and compliances as well. So Rob, quick introduction from you.
Yeah, so I lead security at Vanta. Vanta is a compliance and security automation, and I like to think like orchestration platform. Helps people build and run and monitor their programs, and then demonstrate trust to people who might be interested, such as auditors or customers. My background's in sort of penetration testing on that side, and then I worked in finance at Robinhood, as in fintech, but in security. At Robinhood, did a startup through Y Combinator for a while, and then ended up at Vanta.
Awesome. Good to have you, Rob, here also. Excellent. So just a quick reminder to everyone that tuned up, leave your questions in a comment box. It'll be interesting to tackle the questions that you particularly issues might be facing, questions you might have. So we might answer those as we go through the topics, or we'll do Q&A at the end as well if there's any missed out topics that we haven't covered. But yeah, feel free to ask questions. It'll be great for everyone to share their thoughts. All right, so let's dig down. probably number one thing I want to start with is actually defining what is digital health organization. So it is obviously interesting to talk about healthcare, and it's a massive industry, massive field worldwide, as we discussed. But what is that digital health organization? Of course, I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I use Whoop, that digital health application itself. So often it's actually defined as a platform, an app that companies are actually developing in digital health space itself. But does that go any further, especially if we're looking at current structure of physical healthcare, and how does that differ from digital health organization? Perhaps, Beth, you can help me a little bit here with that definition and drawing a line. Do we know what is digital health organization itself?
Sure. I'm really not sure if we do. I think it's can be a pretty wide definition, because I think there's some that they're super obvious. Like Maven is a cloud first, health app, right? So that totally makes sense that that's sort of the space that we're in. But if you think there's everything from, wellness and coaching apps to therapy apps that still sort of fall under that more obvious definition. But, every app that collects data, that's all the like the Internet of Things devices that we're constantly collecting. Like your phone is collecting all of this health data, all your different wearables, right? And then on the other end of it, we have sort of the brick and mortar healthcare that we think of hospitals, and think of how many digital aspects we have, right? So many of those machines are aligned. Again, the Internet of Things. We have digital health portals that we go to for information, right? So there is this huge span of like how healthcare is delivered, and also what we consider health, right? So it is a very, very, very broad category. And I think when you start talking about the compliance and security requirements, it is hard to make a one size fits all, because it is a very, very broad category.
Maybe I can kind of interpret what you're saying there a little bit and add on something. It sounds like a lot of it is about like, what is the data that organization handles in some way? And it's, kind of hard to define, but what is health, fitness data, all that kind of stuff. That is a sensitive category of data that people just inherently don't want. They have legal protections against being used in certain ways. And then obviously you mentioned like hospitals and other sort of clinics and that sort of stuff, where it goes beyond, it's not just read only, right? Like you can actually make changes to people's health based on, access to certain systems. And so, that's a very polite saying way of, you can hurt somebody if you get access to, certain systems in a hospital or something like that. Right. So, yeah, that's really interesting. It is hard to define, but it's just a really sensitive category overall, akin to finance, but probably on another level even.
They can cause terrible harm if something goes wrong. It's just a different kind of harm. Sorry, Gerald.
Yeah. So actually, that goes to the back at what exactly you just said, Beth. I was going to ask, digital health organizations, do they have any unique cybersecurity challenges they face? Are they different to normal healthcare organizations that cybersecurity challenges they face? Because what you said, Rob, also, it goes back to the point of digital healthcare apps that we use, right? Like I mentioned a couple of times, like a specific watch I'm wearing that collects my data. So now I'm actually providing that data at my own will that collects a lot more information than compared to a normal hospital that would have my CT scans, for instance. So are those any unique challenges those organizations face, especially compared to other industries or healthcare altogether?
I'll start, and then Rob, please feel free to jump. I think there's two immediate things that sort of jump to mind on this. One is the compliance part of it, because a lot of the compliance requirements are not built for the digital world, right? The number of times I have to say, I don't have a DMZ, everyone's like, you need a DMZ. I'm like, but we're not connected to on-prem, we're just cloud, right? So you have all these categories that like people don't fundamentally understand, because the compliance regimes are not built for digital categories. That's for something that's sort of digitally native. On the separate side of it, I would also say one of the things, when you are going to a doctor, right, there is a more or less culturally agreed on, doctor-patient relationship, if that makes sense. I think across, whether it's wellness or coaching or therapy, I think we're still sort of trying to define like how data is used, what the expectations are. And I think as this is growing so quickly, I think we're constantly navigating that space of like, we are here to support our users, in the best way possible. And some of these apps, like at the very, very vulnerable points in their lives, right? So navigating that relationship as these expectations are sort of changing and growing on the edge of the space is sort of a difficulty that maybe more traditional health organizations don't have. But again, those traditional health organizations do have a digital aspect to them. So it still is like, how are we navigating security and privacy and trust, right? With everybody, because everyone uses healthcare at some point. We all have that right to privacy.
Yeah, I think that's like, you use the word expectations, and I think that's a really good, like, sort of central point here. There's very unique expectations with health, and sometimes there's a lot of gray area where it's not clear what the expectation is. You mentioned like mental health apps, that kind of stuff, right? That's like, hey, pretty clearly that's like a health type of thing. But what about like relationship coaching? An app that lets you do that. I know some of those are out there. It's like, well, wait a minute, is that health? Like, not, but man, if I want anything private, it's my like, problems that I have with my relationship, right? So I think the expectations are really hard, and it's really hard when you get into like, what are the expectations of some of the people who are enforcing these, requirements, such as auditors or the like, right? Like you said, they're like, have an expectation that you fit a certain pattern. You're like, wait, no, but like we use different stuff, and it obviates the need for that stuff. But it's hard to bridge that gap sometimes.
So that probably means that digital health organizations, they have to sort of lead and identify that threat landscape themselves, and then obviously implement the tools that would protect the customer's data, because maybe they don't have those guidances drawn up just yet. But how would one identify that threat landscape itself?
I mean, that part I think is still threat modeling, right? Understanding, what your valuable assets are, what your valuable data is, and who might be coming after it. I think, and how they might be doing that. That's pretty classic threat modeling. But I think sort of the more that's up and coming is the relationship with, again, that expectations that Rob just came back to, right? How are consumers expecting that their data be used and expecting that be, protected. So I think that's sort of the thing that's still evolving, because I think these ideas of like privacy and data ownership and data use, right? Those are still evolving. But I think when it comes to threat modeling and just understanding who's coming after you, that's pretty classic. As far as saying like, what's valuable, what do we want to protect? It's always the, princess in a castle. We've got to come up with something better than that. So I don't know. A fancy person in a high tower, how are we protecting that? And understanding what should be more protected, right? That's pretty classic. But I think sometimes, we have a much more casual relationship with technology. And I think as consumers are starting to realize what that means and how all this data is being, valuable to a lot of other people, that relationship continues to change.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you bring up about threat modeling too. It's it's important to remember, like, ultimately digital health organization, it's just another there's a lot of overlap with security in general, right? Like broad security industry stuff, all that still applies. There's not necessarily a lot of special protections that you need to put in place in terms of just the security component. But security is I think that I've heard this phrase, security is a necessary but not insufficient prerequisite to privacy, right? And I think when you get into the special things about digital health, it really is about that privacy aspect. What is appropriate use of the data? And obviously we're moving into a world where that is considered on all of my data, not just health data, but especially health data, right? So I think, yeah, things like threat modeling, those are sort of really well-established techniques that, I think are still evolving and everything over time, but those apply just as much to, any, B2B SaaS app or consumer app or anything like that as a healthcare system.
Absolutely, Rob. I think it comes to the point where with digital health organizations now booming and everyone kind of trying to jump on board for one reason or another to utilize tools like that. We obviously providing that sensitive data to those organizations, and that data is our healthcare information. And at a personal level, I would say that protecting that sensitive information around my health, around my data that is being collected by the tools I use, to me, it's actually more important than protecting my information I post online somewhere, right? Which is automatically, for me, it's public, and I do want to have protection around that, but not as much as I would like to protect my healthcare information. So moving on to slightly different topic, well, not different topic, but sort of progressing that conversation into managing that sensitive information in the context of digital health organizations. What type of sensitive data typically is collected and managed? Of course, we understand healthcare information, but what data are we talking about?
I think that's super, super broad, right? I mean, I think but my fun exposure to this is also like looking at all the data that, like, when we're looking at different tools that we want to use, all the data that vendors want to collect from us, right? And I think this goes back to, you know, Gerald, if you're saying that this is important to you, one thing I also teach, and I'm always like, my students are like, this is so depressing. I'm like, read your privacy policies, right? Like, the number of times people come to me just at work and say like, hey, I really want to use this tool for XYZ reason. I'll be like, okay, well, this is the data that you're going to be giving them. This is how they can use it. And then 9 times out of 10, it's like, oh, how do you know that? And it's like, look at their privacy policy, right? If you can, look at the permissions and all that good stuff. But like, they're telling you what they're doing. No one reads privacy policies, right? I do think that, like, as people realize that there are privacy policies that do say things and start to take ownership for that, we will hopefully see some more interest in that driving forward. Because I do think that the type of information totally changes, right? You know, sometimes it's just like information that you provide. There's definitely some apps out there that are integrating with everything on your phone, right? And then there's definitely some apps that are collecting information like maliciously, right? Because you're just allowing folks to download whatever. So I think like what data is being collected is a hugely broad category. If you take what we talked about as a digital health organization earlier, and then like, I honestly like fold that out into like infinite proportions, because if there is, you know, any app some sort of data is being collected by every app, if that makes sense, right? Our data collection is actually quite narrow where we are right now. But, you know, different apps are going to be collecting different things. We all know that we are carrying computers in our pocket and feeding that data to a lot of different sources.
Yeah, I think, you know, the sort of like concept of like sub-processors that you brought up, like vendors that are like, what data are they going to collect from us? I think it is really interesting because it's a hard thing to manage, right? And this kind of goes sort of back into the like, okay, managing your organization's security program. Like, how do you actually make sure that, you know, things change over time, right? So you might say, hey, vendors coming in, they want to collect, you know, our users' names, and we're like, oh, that's fine. We need to do that for a good reason.
We're only going to use it for this. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So you put it on your sub-processor list, and you tell all your, like, they collect your names, and you're like, okay, that's fine. And then, you know, a year later, you find out like, oh, you know, we're giving them all of the blood data and all of this now. They have a new thing. It's cool. Like, no, like you can't do that. How do you manage that, right? I think that's that's a really tricky thing, and a lot of it's sort of just like human, which means it's error prone.
Yeah.
I think
that's actually scary. It makes you realize that the type of data can be collected. We're not just talking about your health information. It could be any sensitive information, even private information that sub-processors might be collecting also, right at the back of it. So I would ask at the back. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
And I'll sort of make a distinction there, because, you know, we are very lucky to be in a position where, like, the major platforms are actually doing a pretty good job of on the consumer side, making sure that you know what's being collected and when. And you know, I think especially in terms of like apps, you know, any app store, like if they're going to collect, you know, certain health data from you, you're going to have to approve that, and you're going to see that, and you don't have to read the privacy policy to know that, and that's nice. Like, I think honestly, I think this is the case where centralization has proven to be very good in a lot of cases, because, you know, if I want some company to have my like step count, I can give them that without giving them my heart rate or whatever, right? You know, the very fine-grained health data. I think, you know, it's trickier when you have a situation like, oh, I sent off a blood test to some company, and obviously there's a lot of information they could get from that, and they say they only take this and throw the rest away. But that's that human element. That's where it starts to become a little bit less clear. And you know that, like, even if the legal department of that company says one thing, then somebody in that company 6 months ago might have changed their mind, and without telling, you know, it gets to be a very human, messy problem.
Yeah, we had a conversation recently with a vendor, and I will say, like, I adore my legal team. I adore my IT team, which is amazing. Like, the folks I get to work with, because it is such a team effort. And I was on the phone with some folks from legal and compliance with a vendor, and I was like, but if you look at the permissions, it says you can do this. Like, it was dealing with essentially an extension. And I was like, how do you, like, well, that's not the way we use it. And I was like, how do I know that? They're like, you just have to trust us. And I was like, I don't know what to say about that. Like, that's just not, oh, this is terrible. So it's definitely, I think, a human issue and a messy issue, right? Because we are always the problem. We can be part of the solution for sure, but I think the best pen tester is an executive who has a broken laptop on an airplane. And like, how did you invent all of our security controls. So yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, sadly, that's the case with pretty much every vertical, every security threat itself. I mean, human error is the biggest thing that causes security threats itself and issues. So I was going to ask as well around, so how can digital health organization itself maintain strong cybersecurity measures, especially in light of having to balance that need for data accessibility with the importance of cybersecurity?
Sure. And Rob, I'd love to hear your perspective on this because I know we come from two very different angles. I think specifically, so one of the top, like the theories that I always drive is like security and compliance are not the same thing, right? I think Rob touched on that earlier, right? Like, especially when going back to the fact that compliance regimes were not developed for digital health companies, but they are they're necessary to operate in this space. And I think if you build on that foundation, I think if you use compliance as a foundation, but understanding that it's not sufficient. When I say understand it's not sufficient, I think your executive team has to understand that. Your stakeholders have to understand that. The teams, legal and IT, need to understand that when you're all working together to put together sort of a roadmap to build what is that security that aligns with the threat modeling that we mentioned earlier, right? I do think it's absolutely a team effort. You really do need to have sort of that tone on the top and the understanding. You need to explain the risk and then mitigate the risk, right? Cybersecurity risk is a risk like anything else. So you just need to understand the risk and then, take the steps to mitigate it. But it's definitely an ongoing conversation. So and the environment changes every day. Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I will come at it from just a different angle on the question. I think, my perspective is it's very similar to any other type of organization, like I kind of mentioned before, but, digital health and healthcare organizations in general, they are, I think, in this challenging space where they either are dealing with or interacting with systems that are very legacy systems, right? Very similar problem to what happens in finance, right? Like much of the financial infrastructure is, very old school. It's like you're literally dropping SFTP files in a server once a day to do all of your work, right? And, things like that can sort of bottleneck how modern you can get with your controls, right? Sometimes it's like, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It works. But like sometimes it really does cause challenges there. So I'd say, in general, just trying to embrace new technology. There's always this risk of like going after the shiny new thing and stuff. But I think the security industry is in this really awesome space right now where there's this like blooming, innovation happening all over the place. Like every other day, there's some new security tool, and you could look at that cynically and be like, oh, they're just all newfangled. Or you can look at it and be like, oh, awesome. We have this like entire generation of people who are dedicating their lives to like, trying to make some big, cool security innovation and make a bunch of money. And that's awesome, right? And I think, going after that and checking in on like, hey, what's actually going on in email security these days? Or what's going on in endpoint security and what sort of like state of the art and, my SIM and like my cloud security and all that stuff. You can sort of just try stuff out and use it. And I think, if you're in a situation where you're in a healthcare organization or a finance organization or one of these that kind of is like, the people you have to talk to about stuff, as Beth was saying, like they don't understand new things a lot of times, and that's just the nature. You have like good and bad, and some people are a little bit old school. It's a challenge. You have to like overcome that. Like, here's what I'm doing that's new and interesting and cool. And now I have to go through all the work of explaining to you how that meets your requirements. But I think that's worth doing, right? I think it's better to do that than throw your hands up and say like, we'll just deal with the pain of using old stuff because you're just going to get left behind in terms of like the actual protection you can provide to your customers.
And it's frankly, it's super expensive too, right? Like, doesn't make sense, all that legacy stuff. I will actually also, one more thing, I will shout out like AWS and GCP, and maybe Azure, I'm less familiar with it, but are doing a lot as far as building out the sort of the inherent security functionalities like in the cloud. And then to call out Microsoft too, like some of the stuff that you now have in O365, like the security has come very, very far that you can sort of in the tooling. So that's a really good thing to see as well, right? Because it's way easier to use stuff that is native versus like trying to kludge together stuff and like make it all work together. So that's actually a very welcome change as well. And does make things a little bit easier.
It makes sense. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, and obviously someone is doing that for you. So at the back of that, what about then? How does that how does compliances and regulations come into play at the back of that, especially in the context of cybersecurity for those digital health organizations?
You know, I
Rob?
think
Or
Rob.
sorry, Beth?
No,
Yeah, no,
please.
yeah.
So Rob, get in on that.
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at it. You probably have a better answer than me. But yeah, I think it really comes down to that challenge of explaining the difference, sort of like explaining that this thing meets these requirements, even though you have not heard of this thing before, right? Like, you know, you can have folks who just like you're trying to explain to them why you meet a certain, you know, compliance requirement, and they, you know, the audit industry is a very old industry, and there's people who, you know, not changed in that time, right? Who have kind of like taken a very old school approach, and like that's kind of what they do. And you can try to explain to them like, no, like AWS, it's like there's like a server and it's somewhere else and it's okay, but like it's like Amazon and they're really big and so they're secure. Like, you know, like it's hard to like, you have to actually start to get really down to like first principles and start to explain like, no, like this is why what I'm doing maps to what you're doing, what you think I should be doing, and is actually better than that, right? And I think there's like a newer, you know, like newer auditors or people who just have kept up with the times, and like you get to the point where it's like, hey, yeah, like I understand what you're like. If you say AWS, then I'm going to scratch off like half of my questions because I understand that they no longer apply to you. But I think that's one of the biggest challenges is just explaining like the difference between, hey, there's new stuff and it applies to the old stuff in a very similar way, and the principle of the spirit of the sort of requirements.
Yeah, and I think
Beth, as I hand it over to you, just to expand the question even further, I think from what Rob said as well, it's interesting, at least for me to hear as well, as we're expanding from traditional way into digital world itself. How does HIPAA actually expand into that also? And does it fully catch up to be up to speed with digital health organizations? So I think that's around regulations and compliance and cybersecurity. So we hand it over to you, Beth. It'll be interesting to hear.
Sure. I'm not a lawyer. Like, let's be clear, I'm not a lawyer. So, and HIPAA is definitely in the legal realm. So, but HIPAA does require you to have a security program, right? That's essentially what it does. That is like measure it with the data that you're trying to protect. So if we're just, I mean, I think what I appreciate about HIPAA is that I think that if you really adopt the principles of it, I do think it gets you pretty far because it gives you flexibility in like how you're adopting them, right? When it talks about like minimal access policies and some of those access management issues, I think how you're able, I think it tends to be a little bit more flexible, to be totally honest, than some of the compliance, check the box, do you have this answer? I think Rob, one of my favorite stories was about the auditor that was like, does your GCP run on AWS? Like he just never heard of GCP before, right? So, which is fine, but like I'm just like, and okay, like we're working together on this, and he was lovely, you know, and trying to do the right thing, but like it is constantly education. I don't, you know, then there's also other regulations coming out, like the new cybersecurity, the national cybersecurity strategy that gets into the secure software development framework, right? I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that's adopted. You know, even if it's not necessarily applicable to digital health organizations, right? NIST sort of has become the framework to go to, right? We don't know if it's going to become regulation any day, but it becomes like sort of a blueprint to align yourself with. So I do think in the regulatory space, we are making some interesting steps forward. There are definitely some regulations I appreciate. There are still some regulations I tend to bash my head against. And I'm consistently looking for opportunities to sort of work with regulatory making agencies to have that private public partnership conversation. Because, you know, I'm sure it's the Googles, it's the IBMs. And when I tend to enter these conversations, I'm usually the only like app entering the conversation. So I think there's definitely a place for regulations, and I wish it were a bit more cooperative sometimes.
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting on that point. I think there's like some of these frameworks are really developed with a lot of forethought for like, hey, things are going to change in ways that we don't understand. Therefore, we're going to write like the spirit of these into the requirements, and then the expectation is that auditors will apply that spirit to the current environment and, you know, what they're looking at, right? And I think that system works pretty well, actually. You know, all things considered, like it's imperfect by a very long shot, but you know, it's kind of similar to I'm a little bit more familiar with like SOC 2, right? And SOC 2, like the number of things in SOC 2 as a framework that are hard requirements is not very large. but like you better be doing all of those and then some, like you actually have to like, address the spirit of those things. And it really is more like principles and more things that you need to be doing. And it's usually pretty clear if somebody just doesn't care at all and they're trying to like mentally check the box. And it's really hard to like mentally check the box without really going and saying like, look, I understand what this wants. Here's how that like spirit of the law sort of applies to my environment. And here's what we're doing as a result. So you end up in a position where you can make those like, hey, look, like, yeah, when this was written, this thing didn't exist. But now that this exists, obviously that meets the spirit of this. And you don't have to actually change any of the text that's written in the thing, right? I think a lot of these frameworks are written in a similar way.
So in this context, what are the specific challenges that digital health organizations actually encounter then when they go through those regulatory compliances from your experience?
Because there are definitely audit requirements that do not necessarily align with a cloud-based company. So again, with digital health as such, that wide, broad sort of span, I would say that the variety of digital health organization architectures do not always align. Because of the variety of them, it's very hard to get them to align to that set of controls. They are pretty flexible, as Rob has stated, but sometimes if you don't have someone who understands the spirit of it versus the new technology that's being used, right? We all end up with McAfee AV for the rest of our lives, right? So it's just because it is such a varied set of architectures, it's hard to get a checklist. And if we are moving to a checklist world, it can be a difficult, and it's resources, right? Like I have a small squad. For every time we have to sit down and explain to an auditor why, again, just to use a DMZ example, right? How many hours are we spending doing this that we could be using to tune our SIM, to do all the other security things that we need to be doing? So it is a resourcing issue. And that's where I think that regulations can actually end up being an issue when it becomes so onerous. And I'm not sure all the time, like if the same set of privacy regulations that were designed for a hospital, do they apply to a wellness app, right? Is that it is information, but is it as important? Why is it important, right? So I think we have like PHI and that's sort of our only bucket, right? And I tend to be like way more on the privacy side. So I'm not saying we should protect things less. I just don't think we are nuanced enough to understand that quite yet and to effectively secure things with auditors as a result.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Sorry, Gerald, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead, Rob.
I think, it is, and it's hard to have that conversation because it is nuanced. You could say like, oh, well, all PHI, all data is really important. Everything's important. But it's like, well, okay, but when you're talking to an auditor, you have to be able to say like, this is more important than this. And you don't really have the tools for that because you really just have like, is that health information or not? And like, well, yeah, but like we can agree that like, the step count is less important than their DNA, like, genome sequencing. Like there are certain things that are like more important, and we need to be able to have a nuanced conversation about this goes into this data system and it's encrypted this way. This one is used in a different way and it has maybe different security properties. And it is hard when I think the regulations are, or I say regulations, but also the just general frameworks are not very flexible or not very nuanced, right?
And it's just like, I was like, why? We had a medium finding with an external test recently. I was like, why is it a medium? And they're like, well, this is what medium means. I'm like, I know what medium means, but like, why is it a medium? And they're like, well, the system said it's a medium. And I was like, okay. Because again, going back to the fact that like, I now have a deadline to remediate this, and there's other things that I'm no longer able to do. So it's that balance of prioritization as well. So,
yeah. So that's such a good point. And actually, Gerald, you mentioned that statistic that something a certain percentage, 70% or something like of
71%. Yep.
Yeah, of healthcare apps, digital health apps. I'm paraphrasing poorly, but everybody was here, I'm sure.
Have at least one vulnerability.
Have at least one like critical vulnerability. Yeah. So when I heard that too, I was like, well, I bet they don't. Like I bet if I looked at those vulnerabilities, I'd be like low, because that's, when you run a scanner on an app or something like that, everything's critical. You turn on a new tool, you get 1,000 critical findings, and you look at it and you're like, none of these are even like here, these are all like either half of them are just wrong and the other half of them are like insane to call them critical, right? I think or high or medium or that kind of stuff. And I think that is one of the things that really highlights the difference between sort of that older school mentality with like security and sort of that like, where the security industry came from, which was, a very heavy-handed, rigid approach to things. And hey, like the CVSS for this vulnerability says this, therefore, and you're like, yeah, but that doesn't actually apply to us in any meaningful way. The difference between that and the difference between like sort of a more modern approach, which is like that said, you look at something, you're like, this doesn't actually make sense as a medium to me. Why am I gonna, reprioritize all of my work to do this instead of doing work that might actually improve our security in a more meaningful way, right? And I think that's a really good delineation that represents some of these challenges, because when you go and talk, like, I've had conversations with auditors. Vanta's not a health organization, right? We help people get HIPAA compliance and these sorts of things, or get ready for HIPAA compliance and that sort of thing. But we don't deal with PHI ourselves. But we deal with a lot of audits ourselves, right? And you have these conversations with auditors. You have to explain to them, like, look, this thing that you want us to like look at all these vulnerabilities and stuff, that code does not run, right? That or maybe that is code that doesn't run on a server that's not on the internet, that's in an environment that's not touching data. Like, we really don't care about that particular thing, and so we are going to scope it out of our system. And you have to have these really long conversations sometimes to justify that, because you have to just like really push to bring them into the mindset of, hey, that you can say like some things just don't matter. Like, you don't have to have this very rigid approach. You could have a nuanced take and then focus on the things that really do matter, and make sure that when you actually do have a high severity vulnerability in a system that you need to protect, that it is done in 10 days or whatever it may be, right? Whatever SLAs you might have.
So should regulatory compliances be included into that cybersecurity game plan for the organization? Or would you say it's not going to be at the top of the list?
I mean, it's definitely at the top of the list. HIPAA is a federal law. So like not going to jail is like up there. I don't know if you go to jail, but I really don't want to find that out. But yeah, complying with federal law is definitely super important. Same thing with GDPR, right? I think what we're saying is that like the regulatory risk that we are, if the regulation exists to keep us secure, the regulations are not always aligned to what actually security looks like. So they're very important because they are a legal risk, a compliance risk, contractual risk, all that sort of thing. But it doesn't mean that our security is getting any stronger as a result.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. It's like, sorry, I was just gonna like add on. It's like, there are moments where you realize that you have to do something because the regulatory risk is there, but there is no security risk that you're addressing. And when that happens, you're like, well, this was obviously a failure of some system, right? Yeah. Something went wrong here, that I have to do something so that I can prove that I'm secure, even though the thing I'm doing to prove that I'm secure doesn't actually affect my security, right? And I think that's one of the things, and it's inevitable in any sort of regulatory system, and you hope that it just evolves over time, and those moments are decreased over time, hopefully, as things sort of modernize and kind of keep up. But that is sort of like a moment that happens a lot, right? And I think that's a really frustrating thing for our customers a lot of times, where you talk to someone and you're like, look, you could argue that you don't need to do X, and you could have that conversation with the auditor, and you could spend a day on it, and you could or you could just do it. It's going to take you 5 minutes. And it always feels a little bit gross to have that suggestion, but sometimes, like, for the business, that's just the right thing to do. You're not here to
Rob,
be principled.
Let me jump in here.
Yeah,
I've got a question for you then, because obviously for you do this day-to-day basis, right? You help customers to become compliant, so you immerse in that world. But imagine myself, I run a small digital health company of some sort. I have a small team. And for me, obviously, I need to go to certain regulatory compliance. Can I do that myself, or should I actually look to get assistance, from companies like yourself? I'm looking for unbiased opinion as well. Is there a possibility for companies to go through that compliance process themselves and be able to identify that, or do you reckon they're going to be too biased and might be unable to necessarily objectively identify the risk and be, get ready for the compliance process?
Yeah, I mean, obviously people can do it by themselves. People have been doing it by themselves for a very long time, right? And And there's also, if you're a very small company, a lot of times you kind of fly under the radar. If that, I think we had talked about in a previous conversation, like if you're a dentist office, like the federal government's probably not like knocking on your door about like, your HIPAA violations because you put somebody's file in the wrong place. Yeah, I don't know. I terrible examples, but there are like very practically speaking, like you can do a lot of this by yourself. And if you miss a little bit here or there, then you're gonna be fine. Like your business isn't gonna like get, taken out, right? I think, what's important is, one, making sure you are complying with the law. Two, making sure that you have like general, just good security practices. It doesn't have to be anything crazy, but like, don't, like, hey, like use a password manager and like antivirus of some sort. Like, even if it's just with built-in, some like Windows Defender is actually really good. Like, stuff like that, right? Like think about these things, do these things. You can't just ignore these things, but you don't necessarily need to go get help. I think it's just a lot easier. And that could be going and finding a consultant. That can be just like getting advice from somebody who knows what they're talking about, like Beth. Or that can be, using a platform like Vanta that actually, has a lot of that stuff built in and can kind of like get you from 0 to 1 a little bit faster and sort of make sure that you're kind of keeping up with it with, less mental overhead than you would if
Okay.
do you want to spend all, the next month learning about HIPAA? Maybe not, right? Like, you probably learn about it a little, but, outsourcing a little bit of that can be a big win.
And then Beth, yeah, I was going to pass on the baton to you, but I was going to expand on that as well as we touched into the game plan itself, that cybersecurity game plan building that goes into compliances as well. But I want to understand as well, and probably the audience does also, what are the foundational steps the leaders should be looking to take to lay that groundwork for cybersecurity in their digital health organization itself when they're drawing up that cybersecurity game plan?
Sure. It's so building a plan from scratch, I think is really interesting, right? Usually there's some sort of like infrastructure when you start, right? There's obviously some sort of access controls, there's some sort of potential going on, right? So I think you do have to understand your compliance regime, right? And like, I hate having to come back to that, but like you do have to understand what the laws are and what like you need to satisfy your contracts. Like otherwise you lose business. And if there is no business to secure, you're on the job. So like understanding and what those requirements are really, really important. And then I think it's understanding your environment. Again, going back to who's your person in the tall tower, understanding where your data is, like what kind of data you have, where it's coming from, where it's stored and where it's going, right? I really hope it's encrypted. I think it's actually pretty hard right now to not encrypt things by default in a lot of systems, but I think you have to hit the basics, right? In a cloud-based environment, it's a lot going to be access control, and that aligns actually a lot with HIPAA and a lot of the compliance requirements as well. Who has access to it, right? So I think you just start with sort of the basic concepts of just like, what are we trying to protect? What data do we have? Who has access to it? What are our basic controls? And sort of building from there, right? So then you sort of understand and then it's gap analysis, right? Where are the gaps that we have? How do we fill those? If you're looking for frameworks, the CSF, the NIST CSF is actually a pretty solid one to align to, and I think it really helps a lot with executive communication. The critical security controls are a bit more sort of technical. And I really appreciate those more to speak to sort of more the engineering teams. So you're looking for like layers of like, hey, did I think about this? Hey, have I thought about this? So I think as you get to as you satisfy sort of more of the obvious projects, and then it's also, working with product teams. I do think that security is in every, I always say that like, I have a small team. I am a very suspicious person, but if everyone else can be just a little suspicious all the time, right? Our security is that
Paranoid.
Little, I'm not asking for paranoid. I will be the paranoid one. That's my job. But just don't click on that email, right? So it really is like it's education. Everything from like how to protect not just your enterprise devices, but your personal devices, because there is so much overlap now, right? Working with the product teams, working with, again, legal, IT, devs, really getting sort of that security awareness going through. I really do find that so many engineers now just want to do the right thing, right? Like, oh, there's a different way to do this, right? So having that conversation, and I'm not an expert in what they do, right? So it's like, how do you understand the end goal and get there together? So yeah, I think it's understand compliance, hit sort of the big rock items, further gap analysis based on your threat modeling and moving forward and making it a team effort, because I do think it really is a team effort.
Yeah,
Security all the time. That's not how it works.
Yeah. I just want to like double down on your shout out of NIST CSF. You know, we actually recently internally started sort of a project to align ourselves more with that than our own kind of homegrown thing that we've been doing. And it's really powerful. It's nice because it's very much not a compliance framework. It's a, it's a set of outcomes more than a set of requirements, right? And it's a set of outcomes that you can kind of decide, like, what are our requirements with regards to this outcome? Like, I honestly like don't have one off the top of my head, but it might be like, hey, like data's encrypted in transit. And you're like, okay, like, or data's protected, or it's considered, these types of things. It's very like flexible. And then you decide, you kind of create a profile like, well, this is what we do today. This is what we want to be doing. Here's our gap with regards to this thing. And what it really gets you is two things. And you called out both of them. One is, have I considered all the things that I probably should consider? And it's not perfect. Like there's going to be stuff that's, they're not going to consider in that. But like generally speaking, it gives you a lot of assurance that like, oh yeah, there's that one type of thing that like I really wasn't sure about, or like, we don't really have a system for taking in intelligence from the community. And maybe we should just like get an RSS feed and throw it in our Slack or something like that. Could be as simple as that. And two is executive reporting, super powerful, right? Executive board level, like all this kind of stuff. People really like, they know what this CSF is. And if they don't, like, they respect it when they find out what it is, And two, it just shows that like, look, we can all agree we're speaking the same language. We all like are aligned with a, very trusted, respected framework. And it sort of engenders a lot of like mutual trust, right? So yeah, big shout out to NIST CSF. I think that's a really, really strong project, just like all around.
Yep. And I think it's great I'm glad you brought up the board, because I do think like reporting at the executive and board level, and it's really like, when I was a consultant, I always half the time when I started, I was like, I just feel like I'm like the therapy counselor in the room, right? But it's always that sort of like that third party to be like, and this is what they say too, right? And so I think, again, going back to the respect that NIST really has, and I think it is becoming so relied upon, and it does sort of make sense from a doer point of view, and it's pretty flexible. So absolutely.
Yeah.
So with these recommendations for the leaders around, especially security game plan itself, how would the leaders effectively find a balance between from the security requirements and with the need to innovate and agility in their sector itself? Because often enough, right, leaders might see those specific requirements or even recommendations around cybersecurity requirements. They could see those as shackles and, limiting the ways they could innovate and agilely grow as well. How to find that balance for the leaders? Any recommendations?
So Rob, I'd love to hear what you think about this. I think it really goes back to that communication, that conversation, and understanding again that security is there to support the business, right? The business is there to support the business, and so is security. So there's always a way
Great
forward.
point.
I think you do need to effectively explain risk and say like, hey, this is why this matters. I think if security says no all the time, then no one listens, right? Because then you do need to pick your battles and understand really is what is a critical risk, what is a high risk, right? So I think that's from more of like the sort of picking your battles part of it. But I also think the other part of it is, especially in the environment, and like, what can you automate, right? What can you just put as part of your CI/CD that is just sort of another scan that's run, another test that's pushed, and really understand that like, if it's slowed down, it's going to get canceled. Like that's just how this works. So I think you work on the automation of it. You work on building it sort of right into the design process. Hopefully, if you have security as part of the requirements, you're not part of the final checklist saying like, oops, can't deploy, forgot to check this box, right? So getting involved in the conversation earlier is much more preferable, right? You build it in, it's easier, it's cheaper, and just keeping it part of that conversation the entire time. Rob?
Yeah, totally agree with everything you said. I think there's this general concept of like modern security teams that is, we are here to build guardrails, not gates. We're here to build paved paths, right? And if you think about it, like paved paths make you go faster, right? That's the goal is it's not so much, if you can position your team within your company as a sort of force multiplier, a thing that accelerates the business because people can just do things and they know that there are guardrails in place and they don't have to actually slow down to figure this out themselves, right? That's where you should be positioning yourselves. If you are positioning yourself as a gate into getting the job done, then you're gonna have a worse time. You're gonna have worse results in the end. It not only is it a worse place to work for both you and everyone else, but it is actually just the results are worse because I've kind of we have like a few sort of like high level goals of our team. So every quarter when we do planning, it's like one outcome is like reducing risk of information security, incidents. Another one is reducing the friction caused by information security controls, right? And so I'll go to like an all hands and talk about security, quarterly plan, that kind of stuff. And when I say that, I will get messages from people who just joined, like, oh my God, the last team I was at, like, it was terrible. And it was all this stuff. It's so nice just that you're even thinking about it. It doesn't even matter if we have anything planned. Just the fact that we're like thinking about reducing the friction, it builds trust. And that trust is currency. I mean, people will come to us and say, like, we're doing a thing and we should probably do it this other way. But like, we really have this time, like, and you can have a nuanced conversation about like the actual risk. You say, you know what you're doing is actually totally fine. I understand why you thought it was risky, but it's not. Or all we have to do is this one other thing, and it's going to remove all the risk from it, right? I think, we also do like quarterly survey or biannual surveys of like, hey, how is security getting in your way, right? We pair it up with a couple other teams who the IT team and the compliance, but like, how are we getting in your way? What are we doing wrong? And we know some stuff we just have to do. Right. We have to like approve your browser extension sometimes because it's like, hey, this can do a lot of damage and there's not really better tools in place to like address that. But, it gives us that visibility that we wouldn't otherwise have. So I think, security should not be slowing your business down. And if it is, then you really have like other problems, probably. I think if it's really slowing your business down in a meaningful way, then you're doing it wrong, right? I think security can absolutely accelerate your business. It can take away the questions of like, are we complying with all of these things that we have to comply with, and remove the fear, the uncertainty, and the doubt from the situation, and just bring clarity, right? And that it lets you move faster.
I also will piggyback on that, like Rob, because I know we're running short on time, but like, yes to all of that. And I actually wrote down guardrails, not gates. So I'm going to put that in my next presentation too, whatever.
Yeah, I think that was a Netflix thing. Jason Chan, Netflix security team. I think that was something that paid past guardrail, not gates. I don't remember for sure. Yeah,
I like it. But I also think what's interesting, security and having it there also lets you say to your members, customers, clients, users, and yes, we are considering this. We do now, like, we are getting so many more questions than we ever used to get about, and how is my data being used? And even just like anecdotally from friends of mine being like, hey, what does this mean, right? I think people are actively taking the interest in it. And I think that's when security, when you say is like a business driver, it becomes something you can say, hey, and this is how we're considering security. Here's the steps that we were taking to consider this. And I think that is going to become increasingly more important. And I think that to a consumer perspective.
Yeah,
absolutely. And thank you both, because I think, especially as we dig down deeper, it covered some of the questions we had from the audience, especially around how to effectively communicate to the teams the importance of cybersecurity, and certain, how to protect themselves from cyber attacks and whatnot. So I think it outlines it perfectly. I do have one quick question I want to address from the audience. So it was actually referring to HIPAA compliance via privilege access management. So the question was, how can systems be HIPAA compliant with privilege access management? So I thought maybe it was referred to Beth. I don't know if you have anything to add around that over maybe 30 seconds.
Yeah, no, I think that privilege access management tools can be excellent. Going back to sort of the need for access controls, understanding what your data is and who has access to it. I do think that like it can take quite a bit of time, especially in a legacy environment, to put an effective PAM in place. But it definitely, I do think, especially as we're moving more and more to the cloud, that access controls are more and more important, right? Identity access management was like the most ignored thing for the longest time. And as we really change architectures, it's become so important.
It's growing now.
What was that? It's what?
It's absolutely growing now.
Yeah, it's huge. Now it's everything, right? So I think if you're able to, again, and you have to work with your IT teams and your data team, if you have one, to understand where your data is and who has access, but it definitely supports HIPAA compliance. Between minimum use and minimum access, it can be a very powerful and effective tool for compliance.
Awesome. Thanks, Beth. So just to finish up, I would say maybe one key takeaway from both of you. Quickly, what in one sentence, what would be the one key takeaway you want leaders to or audience here to actually leave the webinar with?
I don't know why I'm going first, but go and Rob, unless you got something.
Yeah, I would say Key takeaway, check out NIST CSF. Really, yeah, consider it. Understand it's not a compliance framework and you don't have to do anything it says. No one's going to come ask. No one's going to come check. There's no law unless you're in the government. As you're doing government stuff, then maybe. But, NIST, like generally speaking, like NIST CSF is great. And it's really just a tool for you to consider things you might not otherwise consider.
I would say compliance is not security, security is not compliance, but all of them are a team effort. So we're all doing what we can to support the business. That's what I would
also go to Vanta.com.
Yeah, thank you both. Appreciate conversation. I know time is running very short. I do believe we could continue talking and obviously dig down even deeper. I had more questions, but of course, maybe another time. Just to remind everyone as well, if you do have any further questions around cybersecurity challenges in digital health organizational world itself, compliances, anything around that, feel free to reach out to any of us here, to Beth, to Rob on LinkedIn. And at the same time, of course, Nord Security as well. We do have a business suite products in cybersecurity that can help manage and mitigate certain risks that we discussed today and help to draw that plan in cybersecurity world itself. So feel free to reach out to us at nordsecurity.com/business or to Beth, Rob, myself on LinkedIn. Would love to hear more. Or even if you have any further questions that we might not have answered here today, yeah, drop us a personal message. We'll be happy to maybe even do another webinar for you guys. All right. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Rob. Very valuable.